I started off this morning showing you the vicious circle diagram. And what I really want to do in the next 8 minutes or so is think about alternative futures, because if we're going to think about how to design a system, we also have to think about what world that system fits into. We can't do one without the other, and too often I think we have tried. So if you think about an alternative to a business as usual scenario, a business unusual scenario, what might it be that meets all the criteria that Walt and Kerr were talking about? Well, it would have to have a greater focus on systemic efficiency, so that's people fed in a low waste situation in a healthy way without environmental impacts and the costs that go with that. That would in itself require a greater recognition of the values associated with food. So food, instead of just being a commodity, we recognise that it's something that is nutritious, it's life-giving, it's environment enhancing, it's good for people and the planet. And that will, if we're internalising the externalities, that implies that prices go up, higher farm gate prices, farmers can get more profit from farming less intensively and more sustainably. If we're going to have a food system that's based around healthy diets, diversified diets, that implies that we need to do a different sort of agriculture, a different sort of more circular agriculture, perhaps more mixed farms, certainly more mixed farmscapes, greater multifunctional landscapes, but better for biodiversity, greater heterogeneity, etc. It would imply more rural employment rather than less rural employment, despite a lot of the current thinking about large-scale farms and intensification and robotics, etc. And an efficient food system would potentially make space for land-based climate mitigation, reduces the drivers of climate change and so on. So you could end up with more resilient landscapes and more resilient rural communities and so on. The challenge is not so much that you can't set up a business unusual situation, but it's how to get there. Almost no politician that I've ever spoken to about these issues has said, no, we don't want to go in that direction. It is much more, how does incumbent power and the relationships that are already entrenched and our lock-in that Tom was talking about yesterday, how does that allow us to get there? So I just want to make one point before going on to the kind of main point of this talk, is that there is no silver bullet to change, and often we look for a silver bullet, whether it's technological or whatever. Table 5.6 is indelibly tattooed on my heart, given the amount of effort that went into from the IPC SRCCL, the Special Report on Climate Change and Land, just pulls together some of the families of policy. You can't see them in the table because there are so many families of policy that can be used, and perhaps all of them will have to be used, from education through research, agricultural subsidies, food prices, taxes, carbon taxes, etc., public awareness campaigns, planning law, where can you put a fast food outlet, can you put one outside a school gate or whatever, lots and lots of things. And I think the evidence as it mounts is that no one thing's going to do a lot, but collectively all of them together can make a difference. But what I really want to talk about is that we're talking about climate, we're talking about agriculture, we're talking about food, but the world is changing incredibly fast, whichever dimension that you're looking at. We've got to move away from rules-based international architecture of cooperation post-Second World War. We've got inequality as an increasing driver of social change and people movement and insurgency. We've got climate change degradation and shocks to the system. A fragile system increasingly getting hit is going to potentially fall apart. And of course, Dan, who's our colleague at the front who works on diseases, would talk to you forever about the relationship between environmental change, climate change, and emerging diseases. Coronavirus might be an example where there is a signature of that. We've got so many things that are changing. Healthcare systems around the world are breaking. We need to move to a world where curative healthcare becomes a thing of the past, and we need some preventative healthcare. And people who work on the future talk about the world being tuna, turbulent, uncertain, novel, ambiguous. Nothing about the past is really going to predict how we should be in the future, other than the future is going to be different. And we as linear thinkers, as people, often find that really difficult to cope with. And on top of all that, of course, we have events that happen that can disrupt the way the world is, whether it's Greta Thunberg or your darling president, or emerging diseases, or trade shocks, or climate impacts, or insurgency, or whatever. Events happen that can reshape the world. So I just want to quickly whiz through a set of scenarios for the future that we did with the World Economic Forum a few years ago And that was effectively thinking about where the major uncertainties in the future were around, and the group, expert group that came together grouped them into two major sets of uncertainties. One around how globalization or deglobalization will happen, and one around the degree to which dietary shifts might happen. And you can imagine there are many different drivers of what will create a more globalized or a less globalized world. And at the moment, we are heading more rapidly than we would like to towards a deglobalized world, as my colleagues in economics are talking about it. And if you're in a world of deglobalization and you can't rely on global trade in the way that we're used to, you're moving towards more regional, shorter supply chains, perhaps more self-sufficiency in extremis. And dietary shifts, there's a lot of movement around dietary shifts, whether it's from a education awareness perspective or whether it is because people are incentivized in some way to change their diets. Certainly in the UK, we're talking about curative healthcare and the need to change diets because unhealthy diets are unsustainable from a social perspective, economic perspective. Lots of reasons why people might shift over time. And you can put words in each of these boxes. I don't want to, because I've got too little time, talk about any of the details, but imagine on the right-hand side, the world wants to shift towards sustainable and healthy diets. What happens if the world is more globalized or less globalized in future? And I want to explore that from the point of view of how we think about research challenges. So if we have a world that is governed by global markets, and we've got sustainable and healthy diets, what sorts of things would we be looking for? We'd still grow commodity crops because a comparative advantage would drive that. Still large-scale agriculture. Biotechnology and biofortification would be the main ways into providing a healthy diet, not diversity. We'd still have ultra-processed foods. We'd have lots of long supply chains, lots of robotics, lots of high-tech, et cetera, et cetera. That's a kind of familiar space in which many of us sit. But if you contrast that to a world which becomes less globalized, more regionalized, you might be in a situation that you have to trade comparative advantage for yield, so you're growing a more diverse set of stuff simply because you can't trade it. And if you're growing a more diverse set, that comes with a yield penalty. You'd have to really work on reducing waste. You'd have to have an agricultural policy that was based on nutrition and health rather than based on market demand. Because of all that, you would have to have an efficient, diversified land base. You'd have smaller farms rather than larger farms, less monoculture. You'd need a different form of farming system. You'd need a different set of research challenges. And you wouldn't be able to afford, because food prices would have gone up, you wouldn't be able to afford the ultra-processed food in the way that we do. And there might be a resurgence of whole food cooked at home with the short supply chains. And the real point here is, if we are going to think about what the challenges are from a research perspective into the future, we have to implicitly or explicitly make assumptions about how that world is going to be. And we don't do that enough. I think we too often go on the basis that tomorrow is going to be an analogue of today. And if there's one thing I can bet on, that in 10 years' time, the world will be an incredibly different place than we imagine it to. So just to sum up, I don't think, and we can talk about it at length in the panel, sustainable agriculture is not possible unless we address demand, because otherwise we run into the planetary boundaries. It's not about marginal changes, including efficiency changes in farming practice. It is much more about focusing on food systems, not focusing on crops, focusing on landscapes, and delivering healthy diets in a much more sustainable way. And my final point is, the whole history of social movements and large-scale changes is driven by social tipping points. Many of us theoretical ecologists are used to talking about environmental tipping points and all the rest of that, ecological tipping points, but social tipping points in terms of what will happen when Greta Thunberg's generation, having gone on for another 5 years, is becoming of voting age and really driving things. What is the demand for the social license in Australia still to be built on extractive coal economy? These sorts of things can change very, very rapidly, and we tend to think change is slow and gradual and all the rest of that, but we could have a large-scale event, and it might be coronavirus, that unshackles a lot of the shackles that we're currently in. And then what will happen if society says we must do things differently, and how ready are we to change with all of our sunken assets in business as usual research in the food space, as opposed to embracing the fact that the future has got to be very different. So on that basis, thank you very much.